So let me start with a number, 7.8 million. That's how many barrels of oil per day China was importing by May of this year, down from an average of roughly 11 million barrels a day before this war started. A collapse like that in any other major economy would have triggered emergency measures, panic buying, maybe. Even public unrest. In China, it barely made a ripple. I want you to sit with that for a second, because in a few minutes I'm going to give you a second number, a much bigger one, and when you put these two numbers side by side, you're going to understand something about this war that almost nobody in Washington wants to say out loud on camera. Okay, let's get into it. Here is the part of this story everybody already knows. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air campaign against Iran, hitting nuclear facilities, missile sites, and senior leadership in a single opening wave. Iran's supreme leader was dead within hours of the first strikes. Tehran answered by firing missiles into Israeli cities and American bases scattered across the Gulf, and within days the Revolutionary Guard had declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, laying mines and boarding ships in a waterway that under normal conditions carries roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil and gas. Prices did exactly what you'd expect. Brent crude surged past $120 a barrel within 7 weeks of the first strikes, and trading desks across the world started throwing around one figure as the likely ceiling if the strait stayed shut for good, $200 a barrel. That number never arrived, and the reason it never arrived has almost nothing to do with America's Navy, almost nothing to do with Israel's Air Force, and almost nothing to do with Iran's mines. It has everything to do with a country that never fired a single shot in this entire conflict. So let's actually talk about what China was doing while the rest of the world was watching the missiles. Start with the numbers, because this is where the story usually gets told wrong. China gets somewhere around a third of its crude imports through the Strait of Hormuz, depending on which analysis you trust, and it depends on the Middle East more broadly for close to half of its total oil purchases. When the strait effectively shut down, China did not get a free pass. Its own imports collapsed to their lowest level in nearly a decade, falling from that 11 million barrel average down to under 8 million barrels a day by May, according to customs data. By J.P. Morgan's own estimate, China's pullback alone accounted for something like 74% of the entire drop in global crude oil trade during this period. That is not a rounding error. That is one country absorbing almost 3/4 of an entire planet's worth of demand destruction. So the honest starting point here is this: China was exposed. China was genuinely hurt by this disruption, and anyone telling you Beijing simply floated through this war untouched is skipping over real damage just to make the story sound cleaner than it actually is. But here's what separates China from every other country that took a hit. It had spent more than a decade quietly preparing for a shock exactly like this one, back when almost nobody outside a handful of energy analysts was paying any attention. Independent estimates from the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and multiple other research groups all land in a similar range. China entered this war holding somewhere between 1.2 and 1.4 billion barrels of oil in strategic and commercial reserves. Depending on how you calculate daily consumption needs, that stockpile covered anywhere from about 100 days to well over 200 days of import demand. Now put that next to South Korea, a country that at one point during this crisis had officials publicly admitting their own emergency liquefied natural gas reserves would last only about 9 days. 9 days versus roughly 200. Two countries slammed by the exact same global disruption, and one of them had a cushion measured in months while the other had a cushion measured in a single work week. That gap did not happen by accident. It happened because Beijing spent a decade building a shock absorber while everyone else assumed the crisis would never actually come. The stockpile wasn't China's only cushion either, and this is the part most coverage leaves out entirely. China had also spent years spreading its oil purchases across roughly 49 different countries, deliberately making sure no single non-Gulf supplier accounted for more than about a fifth of total imports. PetroChina's own chairman has said publicly that Hormuz-linked barrels make up only about a tenth of the company's total operating volume, a number that would have sounded almost impossible a decade ago given how central that waterway used to be to Chinese energy planning. China also still produces something like a quarter of its own oil domestically, further cutting its exposure to any single external shock. And then there's the detail almost nobody talks about, because Chinese demand for discounted Iranian crude had already been cooling through 2025, a meaningful number of Iranian tankers were sitting fully loaded offshore, simply waiting to unload, right as the war broke out. That parked oil became an emergency reserve China could quietly draw down the moment it needed extra supply, without a single new barrel having to cross the strait at all. There's also a quieter part of this machine worth understanding, because it explains why China's relationship with sanctioned oil producers survived this war almost completely intact. For years, independent refineries in Shandong province, often called teapot refiners, have been the ones actually absorbing the risk of buying discounted Iranian crude, while China's larger state-owned refiners mostly stayed out of direct purchases after Washington reimposed sanctions back in 2018. This arrangement let Beijing keep access to cheap Iranian barrels while maintaining a layer of plausible deniability at the state level. Washington did try to push back on this during the war. In April, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctioned a Chinese petrochemical firm in Dalian, citing large-scale Iranian crude purchases tied to so-called shadow fleet vessels. Beijing's response was not to back down. It issued a countervailing order, effectively asserting that Chinese courts, not American regulators, had jurisdiction over that commerce. That single exchange tells you almost everything you need to know about the underlying structure here. Iran depends heavily on oil export revenue to fund its government and its military. China benefits not only from the discounted barrels themselves, but from the geopolitical flexibility of quietly supplying a regime Washington has been trying to isolate for years, and it is clearly willing to absorb some targeted sanctions risk of its own in order to keep that flexibility intact for the long run. Now here's the number I promised you at the start, the one that puts everything else in perspective. Societe Generale's commodity research team, led by Mike Hay, compared this entire crisis directly to the 1973 OPEC oil embargo. That embargo cut off roughly 7% of the world's crude supply, and prices still exploded by more than 130%. This crisis wiped out roughly 14% of global supply, nearly double the disruption of 1973, and yet prices only climbed by around 30%, something absorbed almost the entire difference between those two outcomes, and according to Sagan's own analysts, the single largest factor behind it, bigger than every coordinated strategic reserve release out of the United States, Europe, and Japan combined, and second only to Saudi Arabia rerouting its own exports around the closure, was China's own demand. Collapse, sit with that for a second. The country most physically exposed to this waterway chose restraint over competition, and that restraint didn't just cushion China. It quietly cushioned every driver in America paying less at the pump than they otherwise would have, every household across Europe managing a smaller heating bill, every factory in Japan facing a smaller hit to its input costs. China absorbed a global shock almost nobody realized it was absorbing, and it did so entirely on its own terms. There's another layer to this that stretches well beyond the war itself, and it's the part that could end up mattering the most a decade from now. Every energy shock like this one accelerates the search for alternatives, and China happens to control the manufacturing chains behind almost every alternative on the table. In solar photovoltaics alone, China controls something like 80% of the entire manufacturing stack, from raw polysilicon all the way through to finished panels, and industry researchers expect that dominance to hold through the rest of this year given more than $130 billion in investment poured into that supply chain since 2023. The same pattern holds for electric vehicles, wind components, and battery storage systems. Every country that got burned by this crisis and starts looking harder at electrifying its own economy to reduce future exposure to a single unstable waterway is, whether it intends to or not, looking directly at Chinese supply chains to do it. Pakistan has already leaned further into Chinese solar systems during this crisis. Not every country is equally comfortable with that dependence, and some clearly aren't. The United Kingdom banned turbines from a major Chinese wind manufacturer on national security grounds back in March, and countries like Thailand and Malaysia have voiced real concern about what cheap Chinese electric vehicles do to their own domestic auto industries. But the broader direction of travel is hard to miss a war that was supposed to be about Iran's nuclear program, and a fight over a shipping lane is quietly turning into another chapter in the story of who builds the next generation of the world's energy infrastructure. And China entered that chapter with a head start nobody else at the table currently has. There's a piece of this story that has almost nothing to do with oil, and it might be the clearest window into where China's real loyalties sat throughout this war. Back in April, Bahrain drafted a United Nations Security Council resolution, backed by the Gulf states, the United Kingdom, and the United States, calling for an end to Iranian attacks on commercial shipping and for coordinated international protection for vessels moving through the strait. China, standing alongside Russia, vetoed it. In public, Beijing framed the veto around freedom of navigation being a shared global responsibility rather than something a Western-led coalition should enforce unilaterally. In practice, the veto accomplished something much more specific. It shielded Iran from a coordinated international shipping protection framework at the exact moment Tehran was under the most pressure from the rest of the world to give up its grip on the waterway. Analysts at the Brookings Institution have been direct about what this reveals, describing China as willing to absorb genuine diplomatic risks specifically to keep Iran's regime intact, not necessarily out of any deep ideological alignment, but because a wounded, surviving Iran is simply more useful to Beijing's long-term interests than a collapsed or radically destabilized one. China was not neutral in this war, no matter how it looked from the outside. It was neutral on camera, in every public statement and every carefully worded press release, and it was load-bearing behind closed doors, exactly where it mattered most. It's worth pausing here to correct a common misreading of this entire relationship, because plenty of commentary during this war treated China and Iran as tight allies acting in lockstep, and that overstates things. Analysts who study China's regional posture closely have pointed out that Beijing's deeper, longer-term interest in this conflict actually sits more with the Gulf Arab states, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Doha, than it does with Tehran itself. China has spent years building trade, investment, and energy partnerships with exactly those governments, and it has real incentive to see the strait reopen smoothly, since a huge share of its own imports flow through Gulf Arab ports and pipelines, not just Iranian ones. That's part of why China, even while shielding Iran diplomatically at the UN, also reportedly pushed Tehran toward the negotiating table during an earlier ceasefire push, once it judged that continued closure was starting to cost the broader region, including partners. Beijing actually cares more about long-term, more than it was worth. This is not a story about China picking Iran's side out of loyalty. It's a story about China treating Iran as one useful piece on a much bigger board, worth protecting from collapse, but not worth protecting at the expense of everything else Beijing is trying to build across the wider Gulf. While Washington was busy managing 3 simultaneous carrier strike groups scattered across the Middle East, the same scale of naval commitment America made at the very start of the Iraq War back in 2003, China was quietly doing something almost embarrassingly simple. It was helping people. As energy shortages rippled across Asia, Chinese suppliers stepped in to cover shortfalls in jet fuel and other critical energy imports for countries like Thailand and the Philippines, both of which have historically leaned on the United States for exactly this kind of support during a crisis. China also began reselling meaningful volumes of liquefied natural gas to energy-starved neighbors across the region, capitalizing on a domestic gas surplus created by rising pipeline imports and higher domestic production. Even as Asian LNG prices climbed by more than 50% since the war began, Beijing's special envoy for Middle East affairs was on the ground within days of the fighting starting, conducting the kind of visible shuttle diplomacy designed to project stability, while China's foreign minister worked the phones with counterparts across Asia, Europe, and the wider Middle East. None of this cost China very much money, and all of it fed directly into a narrative Beijing has been quietly building across Asia for years now, that America is a reckless, unpredictable partner, prone to dragging the entire region into conflicts it can't cleanly finish, while China is the stable, reliable alternative quietly keeping supply chains and energy grids running when it matters most. Ryan Hass, who directs the China Center at the Brookings Institution, has written that the open disagreements between Washington and its own allies over this war's legitimacy and execution exposed real cracks in America's alliance network, cracks he bluntly described as offering comfort to Beijing. Other analysts have made an even sharper version of the same point, arguing that America now looks just as willing to use force as China does, but far less predictable and far less strategically disciplined about how it deploys that force. For China's purposes, that is close to the ideal outcome, because it doesn't require Beijing to look powerful. It only requires Washington to look tired. And here's the part that should actually worry people in Washington the most, because it isn't about oil prices or diplomatic vetoes at all. It's about what Chinese military planners were quietly learning the entire time this war played out. While American ships and Iranian mines squared off in Hormuz, Chinese strategists were watching an entirely different choke point in their own heads: the Strait of Malacca, the waterway through which China itself imports roughly half of its own oil, and the exact place Chinese planners have worried for 2 decades that the United States might attempt to blockade during some future crisis over Taiwan. For the first time in recent memory, China got to watch America actually execute a real, sustained counter-blockade against a hostile nation's ports for over a month straight, and got to watch just how difficult it proved to fully reopen a single strait even after a ceasefire had already been signed on paper. Every weapon system deployed, every strike pattern used, every gap between what American forces promised they could deliver and what they actually delivered under real pressure has reportedly been tracked closely by Chinese analysts looking for one specific answer: how much of America's declared military power in the Pacific is genuinely deliverable under stress, and how much of it quietly evaporates the moment Washington is forced to fight into places at once. Brookings analysts have described the entire episode as a kind of dress rehearsal China got to observe completely free of charge, a live case study in exactly how tired American power gets when it's stretched across two theaters simultaneously. So let's be fair to the other side of this story too, because an honest analysis has to be. China did not glide through this war untouched, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. Its own crude imports crashed to a near-decade low. Its own tankers moved through the exact same mined, drone-threatened waters that every other nation's ships had to navigate. Researchers at the Diplomat have pointed out that China's stockpiles only ever deferred the reckoning rather than eliminating it, and if the strait had stayed closed for a genuinely extended stretch of time, those reserves would have gradually run down just like anyone else's eventually would. China is not invincible here, and it never was pretending to be. What it was from the very beginning was better prepared than almost anyone else sitting at the table, and being better prepared turned out to matter more in the end than almost anything else once the crisis actually hit. Look at everyone else's position by comparison, because this is where the picture really comes into focus. Japan and South Korea burned through genuine emergency reserves under real public pressure, with officials in Seoul openly admitting how thin their own cushion had become. Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the way nations with no meaningful alternative export route around the strait watched their own oil revenues decline steadily throughout the entire disruption. The United States spent months and an enormous share of its naval readiness managing a war that most ordinary Americans couldn't have located on a map 6 months before it started. China, meanwhile, drew down a stockpile it had built specifically for this exact moment, quietly cushioned the price of oil for the entire planet without ever announcing it was doing so, ran diplomatic cover for its most important regional partner without risking a single soldier, and walked away from the whole episode holding a live intelligence advantage over American military limitations that no amount of money could have purchased on its own. So here's the real question underneath all of this, and it's not the one being asked on cable news right now. The question isn't whether China benefited from this war, because at this point that's barely even in dispute anymore. The real question is this: if China can absorb the largest energy shock in modern history, quietly prop up a wounded ally through a Security Council veto, extract priceless intelligence on the actual limits of American military power, and do all three of those things while sitting completely outside the blast radius and spending nothing but oil it was already planning to use eventually anyway, then what exactly does the United States still control here? Is it the country with 3 carrier strike groups burning through readiness in the Persian Gulf? Or is it the country sitting quietly off to the side with a 200-day cushion in reserve, calmly taking notes on exactly how exhausted American power becomes the moment it's forced to fight far from home? I don't know the full answer yet, and I don't think Washington does either. What I do know is that wars tend to get remembered for their loudest moments, the missile strikes, the mined waterways, the burning tankers, and not for the quiet decisions made thousands of miles away by a country that never had to fire a shot to come out ahead. 10 years from now, when historians sit down to explain what actually changed because of this war, there's a real chance the headline isn't going to be about Iran or even about the Strait of Hormuz itself. It might simply be about a country that spent a decade building reserves nobody thought it would ever need, and then got to test every assumption behind that decade of preparation in real time, at almost no cost to itself. So keep an eye on what happens the next time tension flares anywhere near Taiwan, because if China ends up applying even half of what it just quietly learned in the Gulf, this stops being a story about who technically won the Iran war. It becomes a story about who was actually preparing this entire time for the next one. Okay, I'll see you in the next one.